Why is it that nowadays, when we talk about national security, all we seem to talk about is counterterrorism? Are there not other threats out there? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Ontario, Canada. Listen to Canadian Intelligence, podcast about national security and public safety. Okay, you've heard the story before, but I'm going to repeat it. When I started my career in security intelligence in Canada way back in 1983, it was a very, very different world. We were still in the midst of the Cold War. We didn't know back then the Cold War was about to end. We've been fighting it for the better part of 3.5 decades. And the enemy that we in the West were trying to monitor and to prevent from, attacking us was the Soviet Union and their allies. A lot of this was military intelligence. Of course, the Soviets had nukes. We had nukes. We wanted to prevent what we called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It really would have been mad had we done that. And the other issue that was really important at the time was Soviet interference in our affairs, i.e., Soviet spies being sent to Canada and other Western nations to gather intelligence, be it military intelligence, economic intelligence, whatever, because the Soviets wanted to spread their ideology around the world. Well, after 9/11, that kind of aspect of intelligence took a bit of a hit in the sense that a lot of resources got reallocated to counterterrorism. And the question you have to ask yourselves is, was that such a good idea? Meaning, has the counterintelligence priority, which is what we called monitoring foreign spies, really gone away? To talk about these issues and more, I brought in an old friend of mine from Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, where I worked, Dan Stanton, who spent an awful long time in CI, and he's going to walk us through what he has seen over the past 30 to 40 years when it comes to counterintelligence and what it means today. So, Dan, thanks for coming on the podcast with me.
Well, good morning, Phil, and thank you for having me.
Let's start with the easy stuff, Dan. Can you walk my listeners through your particular journey through intelligence in Canada? What was your career like?
Sure, I will, and for their sake and yours, I'll be really brief. I started, well, like you had said, in the heart of the Cold War. I was hired in 1985 in the first class of civilian IOs for CSIS. We went up to Camp Borden and trained, and then my first 5 years, actually, I was on what they called a hard target. I was on the Soviet desk in Toronto. I worked the KGB desk, which I was just amazed with how lucky I was and fortunate. And I learned from largely the ex-members from the RCMP Security Service. Then a couple of years on what they called Sikh extremist desk, Calistanis, I think would be more appropriate. And then to headquarters, various jobs in CI, also counter-proliferation. I worked 3 years on Iran nuclear. And then I did work, I'd say over my 32 years, I worked about 13 years on counterterrorism, about half of it in a management capacity, most of it in the regions. At one point, I actually ran the national program in headquarters. So, yeah, basically a bit of everything in terms of counterintelligence, counterterrorism, counterproliferation, and a little bit of corporate work dealing with the Security Intelligence Review Committee for a couple of years, just to sort of round it out. In one sentence, I could probably say, having started in 85 and retiring in 2017, I was able to see and witness and maybe participate a bit in the evolution of CSIS from being a purely domestic security service, CI focused, to what it is today, which is it's an intelligence service working overseas as well as domestically in a large variety of requirements, I should say, intelligence requirements. So very, very fortunate to have been part of that and to have seen that evolution.
You share, I think, a lot of thoughts that I have too, Dan, about the sense of feeling very fortunate to have a career, which is not only an interesting and challenging and fascinating one, but one that made a difference. And so, from your perspective, Dan, from the CI perspective, things really did change, didn't they? I mean, after 9/11, as you said,
Yeah,
CSIS was created out of the old RCMP Security Service. It was largely a CI organization when it started. We did a bit of CT. You talked about Sikh problem, of course, Air India, which is
yeah.
the biggest act of aviation terrorism in history prior to 9/11. How do you think CI, and this is a very large question,
Yeah.
how has CI evolved, do you think, since the early days of CSIS to what CI is like today?
Yeah, if we're talking about, we can talk about CI in terms of, what the targets are, the countries, which are largely hostile foreign intelligence services. We can also talk about an approach too, a methodology approach. For example, I mean, Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, but it often operates like a state. So, you look at it in a broader sense, more almost like a CI target. So there's sort of a methodology in CI work that is, I would say, a little bit more comprehensive and cautious at times in investigations than you would find in, let's say, for example, a domestic CT target. But you're right. What has happened, and it started before 9/11, but then it was after 9/11 it got the big boost, is that the pressures were on to deal with, of course, Al Qaeda, and then what became Al Qaeda influenced and Al Qaeda ISIS. And I think at some point, some of those other more traditional investigations, if I want to use that word, kind of, you could say, suffered a bit. They did remain fairly well resourced. I mean, I ran the China program not long before I retired. I mean, um, they're not ignored. It's just because the safety and protection of Canadians is number one priority. The priority has to be CT. And so I think some of the changes were welcome. They were already coming. The service when I joined wasn't just a CI service. It also had a large counter subversion section. They
Of
dealt with,
course, right.
yeah. And what happened is they got rid of all that. There was an assassination attempt on I think it was Vancouver Island in 88, 89. It was an Indian diplomat. And
Yes.
I remember at the time, because I was working CI, but then they had what they called CT enhancement, where they put more investigators on CT targets. You would think that would happen after Air India, but it didn't. And then, as you know, there was other things. There was Jamal Fukra. I'm giving a Toronto perspective, but there
Hmm.
were these early day hints in sort of Islamic extremist world, and then Rassam. Even before 9/11, there were already some shifts in resources and priorities taking place. And of course, 9/11 is just a total game changer. So I guess the short answer is, at the time, yes, these big priorities became lesser priorities, but they certainly weren't ignored. And then it's just a matter, like any organization, trying to adjust, not overstaff it. I mean, CT work isn't in my opinion very labor intensive, but at the same time, try not to spread the butter too thin,
Hmm.
and then you don't really deliver well on some core programs.
Dan, I'm thinking back to my days at CSE back in the early 1980s. I joined an organization, as I said, that was really focused against the Soviet military.
Yeah,
Out of 1,000 people, there were 12 of us, of which I was one who did, and we called ourselves, and we were called the rest of the world. Go figure. And I think that organization, we did have a hard time when the wall fell. We did have
yeah,
a hard time when the Soviet Union disbanded,
yeah,
about changing our focus from the Soviet Union and its allies to this new foreign intelligence mandate.
yeah.
Do you think that large organizations like CSE, like CSIS, like the RCMP, is this something that they struggle with trying to kind of turn the oil tanker in the middle of the Suez Canal and get it stuck? Is this something that takes time to absorb the new challenges and to kind of loosen the apron strings a little bit and not do things like the way you used to do things, or do they do so relatively easily?
I think they don't do it easily. I think it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of navel gazing. I mean, what's really changed from when I started, and probably when you started at CSE as well, is in terms of accountability and performance measurement. And there's a whole universe there where these agencies have to demonstrate, how they use their resources and how they use their money. And the best way of doing that is to be consistent with government direction and what the priorities are, and what the intelligence requirements are. And it's coming through government, and in particularly the ministry, spell that out. So it's not left just to the people that are saying what the threat is, or the collectors to say how they should direct the resources. If I'll give you an example, illegal migration became an intelligence requirement. I mean, this is all in the news. So there were some boats coming off Vancouver Island, and the prime minister of the day was quite upset, as were a lot of people at our immigration system being kind of abused like that. And so a new line of collection was set up. I know because I was the chief of the area that covered it, and the prime minister put Ward Elcock as the guru of that, as I like to call it, or a czar.
Mm.
And it's just a matter of government adapting to what they perceive is a priority, not necessarily, CSIS or CSE. I mean, we're going to
Okay.
provide a threat assessment, but we need to we need to be told, what is it you really want. That's really the way the cycle's supposed to work
Right.
on that, and then go from there, so that they don't get it wrong, like you say, in reallocating, and then there's something that's really required and it's completely missed.
I'm glad you raised that point because that's, we talk about the intelligence cycle and it all begins with requirements, right? The government of the day says, I want to know X, Y, and Z about A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And we are tasking whether it's CSE or CSIS, the RCMP or whomever, you are tasked with finding out that information and providing it to us so we can make better decisions, better policies, etc. So, Dan, CI has obviously changed a lot from when you and I began our careers in the mid 1980s.
Yeah.
Back then, the obvious target was the Soviet Union and their allies. When we look at CI nowadays, I think, as you've alluded to, there are more actors to worry about, meaning there are more people that engage in activities which we would say are covered by Section 2A of the CSIS Act, which is basically foreign espionage, in
Yeah.
some extent 2B, foreign interference, in an unclassified way, based on what you know and the career that you had at the service. What do you think are the greatest CI challenges that Canada faces right now? What countries are we most worried about in terms of their activities in this country?
Well, I think the usual suspects, it still remains. We're looking, Russia, China, and and a few others in terms of, the hostile services, and then you have ones that you would, I could call them kind of neutral, where there's any type of activity, and you see that a lot in the foreign interference thing, where there's, with expatriate expat communities.
Right.
The As far as the evolution of CI in terms of the specifics of the threat, in, my 2 cents worth, a lot of traditional espionage has now been overtaken by cyber. I mean,
Hmm.
it makes less sense to try to recruit someone on the inside in a sensitive job when you can attack and download a data banks. But the other new twist, and there's been some talk about this in the last number of years in the CI threat, is it's what I like to call the soft underbelly. It's where these agencies and services look at kind of the feeder schools to government and the policy forums, and that there was a famous illegals case, Soviet or Russian undercover, that were arrested in the States about 10 years ago. Two of them they were Canadian backstopped. And their targets were all people in these types of think tanks, because they will eventually go on to significant jobs. In this case of the States, you could say Washington and Boeing and everything else like that. So it's the softer targets, I think, are more vulnerable, and the hostile services know that that's a better, easier way in the long term, like a seeding operation, of getting in. And the flip side of it is that threat and vulnerability isn't appreciated.
Hmm.
That's where it's not understood, whether it's universities or things like that. So that's sort of an evolution of the CI threat that I think is fairly significant. It's not someone in a trench coat trying to get in and steal a file
Right.
necessarily. It's an organization trying to cultivate people that in 10 or 15 years may be able to, if not steal a file, weigh some influence and policy shifts in that. And that's a tough threat to identify and stay with and monitor, um, because it's global.
There's so many questions that come out of that, Dan. One is you alluded earlier, the fact that CI, if you compare CI and CT, CT is much more immediate. You're trying to identify a
Yeah,
cell of people that are going to blow shit up tomorrow, and you have to try to stop them. Whereas CI often takes years, if not decades.
yeah,
And if your description of the evolution from the bad guy's perspective is correct, the question that I would like to ask is, well, are the good guys prepared for that? I mean, you've outlined how it works now, and
Yeah,
you're right. I mean, things were very different in the 40s and 50s. We've all seen the movies, and I do know that the American intelligence community was roundly criticized in the wake of 9/11 for having largely abandoned HUMINT for SIGINT. And the accusation was that, well, if they had good HUMINT at the time, they would have inserted agents into the Al Qaeda cells that carried out those attacks. Now, it's a little more, that's a simplistic criticism, but it is what it is.
yeah.
Are you confident that the security services in the West realize this and have successfully retrained and reallocated resources to meet this new CI challenge?
I think they do. I mean, in the Al Qaeda one, it was they didn't penetrate with human, otherwise they would have learned of the plot. But it's a very tough thing to do. I think in this case, it's a hard sell. What we're talking about in this type of, we'll just call it a CI threat, as you say. And it's not just intelligence services; it's a foreign state activity that is kind of gray, and that's always the problem is taking manifestations of threats that are kind of in the gray area and making that sensible and understandable to whether it's policymakers or whomever, a minister of the day, because it's not in your face. It's not like, okay, we've got a spy or we've got a radicalized terrorist who's about to do something, and the RCMP are now taking ownership of it, and everybody understands it. It's all clear. So the long term threat is vaguer and grayer, and and that's not necessarily easy to sell. I mean, because you have policymakers, they've only got a while to read some stuff or be briefed, and they've got all sorts of things going on, and so they probably see stuff in the media and things like that and go, okay, well, whatever. When it's really serious, somebody will tell me about it. But it's hard for people. I mean, you see this with universities, you see this with research facilities where people are starting to make a lot of noise and saying, hey, we got to tighten this stuff up.
Dan, we talked about how the intelligence cycle works, where the government of the day issues requirements. The intelligence agencies, be it signals intelligence or human intelligence, get those requirements. They develop plans to acquire the intelligence. They acquire it, they assess it, they report it, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to CI in Canada, though, I mean, anyone who's at all familiar with various Canadian governments over the years would be forgiven for concluding that the Canadian government doesn't really care about CI. And I'll simply give one example. Former CSIS director Dick Fadden, years and years ago, back in before 2010, came out with the news that certain politicians were being influenced by the Chinese government,
Yeah.
and he was roundly criticized for having said that.
Yeah. And I think part of it was also the timing. It was just, I think it was a couple of days before the G20. I mean, I know because I was managing the program, and it was the timing and the criticism. And again, it's a problem that type of area, we're talking about foreign interference. You people want proof. People want a smoking gun, and it's not like a spy. It's not like a Delisle where you've got somebody. It's black and white, providing classified information to the bad guys, to the evil empire. And so when you're getting into in that particular area, it's foreign interference. It's easy for people to react that way and say, well, you're just profiling, or you're just picking on this state. But I think most of the criticism, it wasn't from Canadians. I think the criticism was, of course, in the media, and of course China wasn't very impressed either. And
No
I think
kidding.
people were enjoying the fact too. I think that a public servant had laid this out, and then some criticized it. But I mean, it's what everybody knew, so to speak. Anyone in the know. But again, that area, which is foreign interference, it's very hard to delineate that sometimes from just lobbying. I mean, there is clearly foreign interference, but it's hard to, in a public domain, make it as clear and obvious as it would be in a more secure forum.
Boy, you're a lot more generous than I would be, Dan, about talking about the Canadian government and its realization that these are problems. Do you think that the successive Canadian governments of whatever political stripe, be they conservative or liberal, really get the threat from foreign espionage and foreign interference, or are we constantly having to remind them only to be pushed back sometimes?
I think, well, two things, Phil. I mean, espionage, yes. I mean, I can't imagine a Canadian government that's indifferent to, classified information being stolen and sold and traders and that sort of thing. So espionage, there's no real debate. Every time a case comes up, it's being dealt with. But on foreign interference, I think it's understood. It's just you're not going to have a pound of flesh. You're not going to have
Right.
you're not going to have someone go to jail. Is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
So the perception is that nothing's being done about it. It's kind of there, like the fact that people can be influenced. I guess there's a certain vulnerability there. Like if someone's got an agenda, foreign interference, you have to have a hidden agenda. There has to be a sneakiness about it. Otherwise, it's just a government lobbying another government. So you have a hidden agenda, you have a sneakiness, and it's designed to, I guess you could say, usurp our sovereignty and our authority and that sort of thing. So, but I also think all governments are kind of, it touches on them as well. It's not a partisan issue. And don't forget, we're talking about different aspects of foreign interference. If you look at what the interference in the U.S. election, where that was very blatant, and I'd say black and white, both from a foreign intelligence collection requirement to national security to domestic to cyber, there's all sorts of boxes you could tick off. That's different than in some cases where you may have a public official who's being kind of, I guess, cultivated or pressured a bit. And then there's foreign interference where a foreign state interferes in a diaspora or expat community in Canada, where they threaten them
Right.
with a homeland issue. And that, when that comes up, and it doesn't come up frequently, I haven't got any indication that the Canadian government thinks it's funny or tolerates it. It's just the stuff you see in the media now. I mean, it keeps going on and on. You read it all the time. If I sound charitable to government, it's like, well, other than briefing, what do we expect, the government to do? I mean, you can declare war on China. I mean, that's like it's not that the government's indifferent to it. It's just you're not going to see any concrete actions that are taken on that type of foreign interference.
I find your perspective on this very interesting, Dan. And I think you're right. There is a challenge there in terms of actions that can be taken. There are obviously foreign relations to keep in mind. There's a whole bunch of variables that one has to weigh. But speaking of all this, then we're still dealing with, I think most Canadians would say that the number one threat to our national safety, of course, is terrorism, whether
Yeah.
it's the Islamist kind or perception that the far right is somehow just around the corner. Where do you see all this going from a CI perspective? Are we going to have the resources required to do this? You know as well as I do that when you work in security intelligence, you never have enough bodies to do it all. You're constantly making choices on whom to follow and whom not to follow, which investigation to launch, which one to close. Are you confident moving forward that organizations such as CSIS and CSIEh and their partners, be it in Canada or abroad, will have the necessary time and money and individuals, men and women, to do CI?
Oh yeah, I think they do. I think maybe, Phil, it's just like it's a different business line, and it just becomes more streamlined than for example when I joined. I mean, I remember I was on the Soviet desk, and then there was the Polish desk, the Czech desk. I mean, it was all sorts of people working these things, and um, with less resources, you just have to be better at it. So I don't see that as being reduced. And the same with the CT threat. I mean, I was running the national program back from 2012 to about 2015, and it was pretty scary. I
Yeah.
mean, it seemed, you remember this, it
Yeah.
seemed like every third person was getting radicalized and wanting to go to Syria and, at Bibo and everything else like that.
Yeah.
And it has kind of settled down. I mean, touch wood. That kind of angst we had at the time of, it's the ones you don't know about,
Right.
which the reality was. That's where a lot of the threats were, the ones that weren't already on the radar, and worrying us about that. But it's not a matter of hiring more people. It's a matter of being able to identify the ones that are going to go from 0 to 80
Mhm.
in a while, and the methodologies on that, and then that's where the co-op with law enforcement comes in. Since that part of the CT piece, in my opinion, seems to have reduced. I mean, I've been retired, but I mean, I do read newspapers. I think that pressure has kind of scaled back a bit, in terms of at least the domestic piece of radicalized threats, and so I don't think you still need to have, legions of IOs and collectors and analysts and everybody else looking at it. Now, who knows? I mean, it could be proven wrong, but I don't really worry about. I don't think the service in particular would worry too much about being unable to deliver with a lot of collection requirements. Maybe it's on the other end in terms of dissemination and
Mhm.
briefings and assessments and that type of thing, and foreign intelligence requirements and things like that.
Last question for you, Dan, and it is coming out of something you just said. When you work in CT, and you know this as well as I do, the vast majority of people that you investigate, they don't go anywhere. They
Right.
couldn't organize a piss up in a bar.
Yeah.
They don't have the intention, real intention. They don't have the capability. They don't have the cojones, the balls to do anything. They're just saying stupid shit online, which is why you investigate them in the first place to see if there's any there. And you determine after a period of time that there is no there, and you can drop the investigation.
Yeah.
Would you say that CI investigations are similar in that respect, in the sense that you look at a lot of people who might be engaged in foreign espionage or foreign interference, but it turns out they're really not, or is it a different game?
It's a good point, and historically, that's why RCP Security Service kept so many files on people, is because something that can be very benign at one point 10 years later can be significant. And so there can be a change to something more serious. It's just going to be over a longer period of time. Whereas on the CT stuff, you have the individuals, and we used to call them couch jihadis, like you
Yep,
said,
I remember that. Yep.
they just talk, but they don't do anything. But then can very quickly, because of whatever's going on in their personal lives or whatever, become an immediate, almost existential threat. So it's the second one is it's the more concerning one, and you're getting more into human behavior and psychology. But in terms of the CI threats, let's if we're talking about hostile services and that, yeah, that little piece of information that was collected 10 years ago can possibly be of great value,
Mhm.
15 years later in an investigation. Whereas it wasn't just a benign encounter on a street, it was something else. And that's where you need to have people that know what they're doing. They have to have certain experience, and it's not something where you get a quick payoff. It's work that requires people to be comfortable with ambiguity and be patient, and not say, "Well, I don't see it. I don't understand. I don't see it."
The one thing that's coming out of our conversation, Dan, very very strongly, is that from a CI counterintelligence or counter espionage perspective, this is very much the long game.
Yeah,
And I want to do an analogy here from the counterterrorism world. Of course, the Taliban told the Americans and us and NATO allies that you have the watches, we have the time. You guys
yeah,
are going to leave eventually, and in fact, we did. Look what
yeah.
happened. Look what happened to Afghanistan. So, Dan, this has been a fascinating foray into an area that, as you said, doesn't make the headlines nearly as much as counterterrorism does.
No,
And yet it is an important part of what our security intelligence services do. It's part of the mandate. It was always part of the mandate going back to the very beginning of the creation of CSIS in 1984. And I just want to thank you for conveying some of the experiences that you had working at the coalface in CI for the time that you did, and providing us with a lot of insight into what these investigations are all about. So thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Phil. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thanks for allowing me to I don't know, voice that and on your forum.
Well, thanks are to you, my friend. So that was my conversation with Dan Stanton, an old friend. I've known Dan for decades, and we worked together, and he is certainly very knowledgeable on CI investigations and CI methodology. What'd you think of our conversation? Love to hear you. You can reach me uh, on Twitter at Borealis Saves or an email, borealisrisk@gmail.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you want to subscribe to this material, please go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. It's free of charge. Get all the blogs and podcasts. You'll also find a link to my latest book, The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present, as seen through the eyes of practitioners. Love to hear what you think of this and other material. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.